Hello everyone, so in this video we are going to talk about building blocks of OOP attribute. In that we are talking about class or static attribute. Let's see the index of learning. First we are going to see what is an attribute, types of an attribute, class or static attribute. Then in coding section we are going to see how we can access class attribute without an instance, class attribute with instance, access class attribute in a constructor, access class variable or attribute in instance method and outside a class, and at last we are going to see how we can modify class variable or attribute. Now let's see what is an attribute. The variables that we used in a class is called attributes. So you can clearly see here with an example. So this is a class. In that we have var is equal to 10, a variable. So we are calling this particular variable a attribute. And you can access that using object here. So this is the simplest example of showing what is an attribute. Next, let's see what are the types of attribute. So we have one instance attribute, and second we have class or static attribute. In last lecture we already seen instance attribute, and in this lecture we are going to see what is a class or static attribute. So if you see the class or static attribute, if the value of a variable is not varied from object to object, such types of variable are called class variables or static variables. So here you can see one example. So this is a class student. In that we have one class variable called school name is equal to ABC school. Then we have a constructor and an instance variable. Next, a class variable is a variable that is declared inside a class but outside of any instance method or init method. So you can clearly see here there is no instance method, and there is a constructor, but we defined our class variable outside of those two things. In Python, a class variables are declared when a class is being constructed. They are not defined inside any method of a class. Because of this, only one copy of static variable will be created and shared between all the objects of a class. So you can clearly see here we have one object S1, we have second object S2, but for both of these objects we have only one shared memory of this particular variable, which is a class variable. You can clearly see here all objects share a single copy of a class variable. Same is written here, a class method is bound to a class and not to an object of a class. It can access only class variables. So in next lectures we are going to see what is a class method. Just to remember, a class method is bound to class, not to the object. And since it can access only class variables, using this class method we can also change or modify class or static attribute or variable. Continuing same, you can see it can modify the class state by changing the value of a class variable that would apply across all the class object. So if you are planning to modify the class state using class variable, so after modifying that class variable, it should reflect on all the objects that you are using and accessing that same class variable. And at last you can see it can accessed by all object of a class or class itself. So in coding section we are going to see these two possibilities. Now all the theoretical part is completed. So let's see coding part for class variable or class attribute. So at first we are going to see class attribute without instance access. So here is our class, name class attribute. In that we have one class attribute, then we have a constructor and instance attribute, then we have one instance method, And you can clearly see here we are accessing the class attribute without instance, so without object, just using class name we are accessing the class variable. And you can see the result, data scientist. You can see the same operation using object. So this is the same class, this is the same instance method, and you can see we created object 1 for this particular class, and you can see here object 1 dot occupation is data scientist. So using object we are accessing the class attribute. Next, in this example we are going to see how we are accessing the class attribute inside a constructor. So this is our class student. In that we have one class variable called school name, which holds right now ABC school. Then we have one constructor. In that we have an instance variable. Then now we can see here using self we can access the class variable, and also using class name inside a constructor we can access the class variable. And here you can clearly see here we need to create an object to initialize this constructor, and after this constructor being initialized you can see these two print statement ABC school, ABC school. So one using self, one using class name. Now let's see how we can access the class variable in instance method and outside class. So this is our class student. In that we have class variable, one constructor, then one instance method. So as we already saw in constructor, we can access class variable in constructor using self or using class name. So here also using a self you can access the class variable inside the instance method, and you can clearly see here school name is accessed, and also using class name, and you can see at the end the result outside class ABC school using self, ABC school using class inside a instance method. Next, let's try to modify the class variable. So here is our class student, class variable school name, a constructor. Then we create two objects S1 and S2 with Emma and Jessica 10 and 20. So before that, let's access class variable just using our object, and later try to modify the class variable just using object. So we used S1 object, and then school name is equal to PQR school, and here you can see the after result. So before that both object are holding ABC school, but when we try to modify the class variable using object of only S1, so only for S1 object the school name got changed. So if you see here, only for S1 PQR school, and for S2 it is still ABC. So as we saw in the definition, we need a class name or simply class or class method to modify the state of a class variable. Now let's try to actually modify the class variable using class name. So we have a class, we have a one constructor, then we created an object, and before that we accessed using object our class variable, and we'll get our value ABC school. Then using class name dot class variable, and we just changed our class variable value, and you can see in before and after result. Before it was ABC school, but after that we got XYZ school for the same object, or for every object now the class name is going to change. Now let's perform the same operation using class method. So we have a class variable, constructor, instance variable, then we have one class method. In that we are taking a value of a new school name that you are going to change. We initialize our class, and in before we access that, and using class name dot class method we are passing a new school name, and you can see in before and after result. Before it was ABC and and after it was XYZ school for all objects. So this is how we are playing with class attribute, using class, using constructor, using class method, without instance, with instance, etc. So we just finished with the coding part. Thank you everyone.